I actually have a question. Is someone introducing me? Is
Yes,
Vivian
I will.
introducing?
Vivian.
Okay.
Vivian,
Yes.
Vivian.
Oh,
Vivian is coordinating.
okay.
Can we wait a couple of minutes? People are joining. So for the people joining us today, hello, and we'll wait just one more minute and we'll get started. Okay, now we'll get started. So welcome everybody again. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone. We're stretching now from 9 a.m. in California, where our speaker is, and some people in India is already late at night. So here we are. So welcome to this webinar, which is the 6th one in our series and the first one for this year for the Trevor Platt Science Foundation. As you know, the foundation is an international organization dedicated to capacity building, organization dedicated to research and enhanced education related to our oceans, working towards stewardship of our planet for future generations. Today's webinar is one of our capacity building activities. And well, just before introducing our speaker, a couple of brief instructions for interaction. Of course, you will see that your microphones are off. And please post your questions as they occur to you during the talk in the QA box, and please not in the chat. And we'll get to them after the talk. So today's speaker is Dr. Daniela de Angeli Dutra. She's a postdoctoral scholar in biology at Stanford University in California. And she's a disease ecologist and parasitologist working in the understanding of patterns and mechanisms of parasite spread and possible ways of mitigation of pathogen impacts. Most of her research is focused on malaria and malaria-like haemosporidian parasites. She applies remote sensing, modeling, and spatial analysis to investigate the macroecological and evolutionary patterns of parasite-host dynamics and the consequences of changes in land use and climate on disease dissemination, transmission. She's an author of 38 publications and is active in capacity building. And for that, we're thankful because she accepted to give us this talk. So the title of her talk today has changed, has been on the work in these days, and is Land Use and Malaria Transmission in Traditional Communities of the Brazilian Amazon. So Daniela, go ahead.
Thank you, Vivian, for the very nice introduction, and thank you, Newton, for the invitation so that I'm presenting here today. I will share my talk in just a second. Is it working well?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yes.
So, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here invited as a speaker for the Trevor Platt Science Foundation. Today, I will present two of my recent research where we investigated how and the extent to which land use change and environmental degradation contributes to increases in malaria incidence among traditional communities of the Brazilian Amazon. And we know that it's neglected tropical diseases can cause, and they are the cause of hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of cases every year across the globe. With climate change and increasing temperatures and more extreme climatic events, neglected tropical diseases can become more prevalent. And it's because of this reason that my research focuses on such diseases such as malaria. And when I'm talking about vector-borne parasites, I'm talking about parasites that are transmitted to vertebrates through the bite of an infected animal. And in this talk, will restrict the concept of vector to arthropods that transmit pathogens, such as mosquitoes. And very importantly, when we think of vector-borne pathogens, they have a huge impact on human health, with malaria being the one that has the highest impact and highest human burden, with approximately 600,000 deaths every year and 200 to 400 million of cases. So for this reason, it's now more than ever crucial to understand how vector-borne pathogen vector-borne pathogen transmission and ecology. And when we think of vector-borne transmission and changes in land use, we know that environmental degradation and land use change can alter the risk of distinct vector-borne disease transmission. When natural ecosystems become degraded, the risk of infection by distinct vector-borne diseases changes, with certain pathogens becoming more prevalent at lower or higher levels of land use transition. So, for example, at areas that are more conservated and areas that are more that suffer more anthropogenic impact, such as cities. When you think of malaria in the Amazon, malaria arises as deforestation starts, and it peaks at early to intermediate stage of land use transition, possibly because of two mechanisms. One of them is the increased contact with vectors. We know, for example, that the main vector of malaria in the Amazon, Nichorhinsus darlingae, inhabits the forest edge. So when we have logging and deforestation, we have an increase of the habitat for those vectors. At the same time, we have a dilution effect, a reduction of the dilution effect due to the loss of biodiversity. So my presentation will be divided in two parts. For the first part, we investigated how changes in land use is affecting the malaria transmission among the Yanomami people in North Brazil. And for the second, we identified drivers of malaria incidence before and after the construction of the Belo Monte Dam in the Brazilian Amazon. So let's proceed with the first part of my talk. For the first For the first part of my talk, we investigated one of the main causes of the humanitarian crisis that is affecting the Yanomami people, indigenous people from the Amazon, a very high malaria burden. But before I start this first part of my talk, I should warn people that are present in this webinar that this research investigates a significant humanitarian crisis and could potentially disturb some individuals who are more sensitive to such topics. Today, I will make the case that the recent land use change that happened under former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro's administration is the main driver of the high malaria burden that contributed to the Yanomami humanitarian crisis. But who are the Yanomami? The Yanomami are semi-isolated indigenous people from the Amazon, and in 2023, they experienced a major humanitarian crisis that led to 900 deaths combined in the years of 2001, 2022, and 2023. This humanitarian crisis is a clear example of how changes in land use can impact human health. But before I proceed with the science, I would like to give you a brief political context of what led to the Yanomami humanitarian crisis. The Yanomami humanitarian crisis emerged in a turbulent political context in Brazil. Since 2015, the former Brazilian president Jair Bolsonaro has grown as a politician and used his speech to encourage the invasion and exploration of indigenous lands. In 2016, illegal gold mining started rising in the Yanomami territory. From 2019, during Jair Bolsonaro's government, deforestation and environmental degradation in the Amazon increased substantially. From 2019, we observed surges in mining next to Yanomami infection sites and an increase in malaria incidents. Further, also during former President Jair Bolsonaro's term, a bill was proposed to legalize mining in indigenous lands, and there were funding cuts made for indigenous health services, encouraging the invasion of the Yanomami and other indigenous lands by illegal miners and the vulnerability of indigenous people to infectious diseases and other health conditions. The combination of those actions resulted in a humanitarian crisis. Since 2023, when we had Lula's term and Bolsonaro is not the president anymore, the Yanomami humanitarian crisis was recognized, and Brazil started anti-mining military operations. And as pointed by Masuda and collaborators, this humanitarian crisis had four main causes. The first of them was underfunded healthcare. The second, mercury contamination due to illegal gold mining. Severe malnutrition, and as I mentioned before, a very high malaria burden. It was hypothesized that illegal gold mining was the main trigger of the Yanomami humanitarian crisis, with estimates that between 20 and 40,000 non-indigenous illegal gold mining were currently living in the Yanomami territory at the time the humanitarian crisis was recognized in January 2023. And we know that mining can impact malaria transmission because, first of all, the illegal mining activity increases vector breeding habitats. As I mentioned, it creates puddles, and at the same time, it also creates a small deforestation, which creates forest edge, that is the habitat of the malaria vector Nisorhynchus darlingi. We also have the fact that mercury contamination weakens people's immune system, making them more susceptible to the disease. And there is also an impact of the increased importation of parasites, considering that miners are non-immune itinerant workers that move from place to place. So you have an increase of human movement. But before I continue with my talk, I would like to point out that the objective of this study is not to vilify illegal gold miners, because the people that perform such activities are usually people that live in social vulnerability. Our objective is to link the illegal gold mining activity with higher incidence of malaria. So with this in mind, our aim was to quantify the role of illegal gold mining and forest loss on one of the main triggers of the Yanomami humanitarian crisis, a very high malaria burden. And to conduct this research, in December 2023, we obtained data on malaria cases in Brazil from 2003 to 2023 from the Brazilian Ministry of Health database for 64 Yanomami infection sites. And if you look in the map, we have the part A of the map and the part B of the map. In part A, we can see the South American continent, and on the top we have a rectangle, a red rectangle, pointing out the location of the Yanomami territory. In B, we have a zoom out of that rectangle, and we have the Yanomami territory depicted in light green, and each of the 64 Yanomami infection sites are represented by the blue circles. So what we did was to collect data on the annual number of malaria cases for each of those 64 infection sites from 2003 to 2023. And to extract land cover data, we extracted data from map biomas, and we obtained data on mining, forest cover, and farming cover from map biomas Brazil. Because we saw no major changes in farming cover over the years, we did not consider farming for our next analysis. And to calculate forest and mining for each Yanomami infection site, so again, each of the blue circles in the image on your left, we use a Google Earth Engine platform. So we created a quadrant of 10,000 kilometers square in the vicinity of each infection site. So each infection site is a coordinate point. And then we calculated 3 distinct metrics. The first one was forest and mining cover, which are calculated as the total cover of forest or mining in each of those 10,000 meters square quadrants. We also have a second variable that was changes in forest and mining, which were calculated as the subtraction between the cover of forest and mining of 1 year minus the cover of the year before. And finally, we calculated the forest edge perimeter, which is the sum of the perimeter of forest edge in each quadrant. And when looking at the number of malaria cases among the Yanomami in the last 20 years, we can see that from early 2000 to 2015, cases have fluctuated. But from 2015 onwards, cases among the Yanomami increased dramatically, especially after surges in mining in the territory, which represented an increase of 300% from 2015 to 2023. As I mentioned before, we started seeing mining the Yanomami territory from 2016. Further, during Jair Bolsonaro's term, malaria cases among the Yanomami have increased even further, reaching approximately 20,000 cases a year in a population of only 30,000 people. And looking at changes in mining in the Yanomami territory, we can see that, like on the image on the top, we have mining cover, and we can see that from 2019 onwards, we have a substantial increase in the cover in mining cover around each of the infection sites. However, when we look, and again, the infection sites are the blue circles in the image. And again, but when we look at the whole Yanomami territory, which is depicted by the green color in the map, we have seen increases in mining cover from 2016. And then when comparing malaria cases among indigenous sites where mining was observed and indigenous sites where there was no mining, we found that the median number of malaria cases in sites subject to mining was almost double compared to sites where mining was not observed. So with all that information, we decided to statistically evaluate and quantify the effect of land use change on the incidence of malaria among the Yanomami. And to do so, we use panel regression models and a causal inference modeling. So here we consider the 64 Yanomami infection sites as units, and we evaluated the incidence of malaria per infection site and year as a function of forest cover, forest loss, forest edge perimeter, changes in mining, along with temperature and precipitation. We also included site and year fixed effects to control for differences in shared temporal trends in malaria. By doing that and using like a causal approach, by running panel regressions, we can ensure that our estimates are not confounded by site or year-specific variation, as our model is comparing each infection site to itself over time. And after running our models, we demonstrated that mining is the main driver of malaria infections among the Yanomami territory, with a 1% increase in mining, increasing malaria by 32.7%. On the other hand, we found a mild protective effect of forest cover with a 1% increase in forest cover or secondary vegetation growth, decreasing malaria by 0.55%. Those results demonstrated the protection and integrity of forests might reduce the malaria burden among indigenous people and potentially riverine communities in the Amazon. But one thing that is also important to point out is that the association between illegal gold mining and outbreaks of malaria have been observed in other countries across the globe, including countries in Africa, such as Ghana, in Asia, Cambodia, and Peru in South America. We know that mining can pose a challenge to malaria elimination and control because miners are frequently non-immune itinerant workers who often become infected and fail to receive adequate treatment. This means, and the fact that this happens increases the chances of drug resistance because there are people that often get infected and do not receive proper treatment. And also, because they do not receive the proper treatment and they often get infected, they present in the territory maintain the circulation of malaria parasites close to mining sites. So in conclusion, we found that illegal gold mining increases malaria in the Yanomami territory with a 1% increase in mining, increasing malaria by 32.7%. We also showed that high forest cover reduces malaria with a 1% increase in forest cover, reducing malaria by 0.55%. We also found that the conservation of forests and indigenous land tenure is a pivotal policy to improve indigenous health and welfare. And finally, we suggest that the transparency of gold supply chain could be implemented to prevent illegal gold mining in the Amazon and indigenous lands. And as for next steps, we are expanding those analysis to investigate the drivers of malaria among all indigenous people in the Brazilian Amazon. And so far, we have found that access to urban centers and, as a result, healthcare affect the transmission dynamics of malaria. Specifically, we found that indigenous communities close to urban centers have mining as the main land use driver of malaria incidence. At the same time, we found that increasing secondary vegetation growth has a strong protective effect against malaria for indigenous communities living in remote areas of the Brazilian Amazon. In addition, we also found that the impact of mining disappears with remoteness, and we believe that there are two hypotheses to explain this trend. One of them is that there is a decrease in human movement and exchange of pathogens with indigenous populations, because if an area is very remote, the pressure of human movement and circulation of pathogens is much smaller. And the second hypothesis is that it could be a bias due to reduced accuracy of data and difficulty of diagnosis, since in remote areas, the access to malaria treatment and diagnosis is harder than in areas that are closer to urban centers, where people have more easily access to healthcare. So now going to the second part of my talk. In this second study, we investigated the resurgence of malaria in protected and rural areas of Altamira after a successful malaria control program. So Altamira, it's a city located in the state of Pará, and it's around that area where we had the construction of the Belo Monte Dam. Belo Monte Dam is the fourth biggest dam in the globe, and we know that as part of the construction and the licensing for the construction of the Belo Monte Dam, because the construction would bring thousands of workers to the area, there was a malaria control program that was required for the licensing and the build of the dam to be performed. And because of this control program, we observed a very interesting trend with cases of malaria like peaking around 1,200 to 700 cases a year before the Belo Monte Dam, a short period of malaria elimination and malaria control with cases being like less than 100 cases a year. And then soon after the construction of the Belo Monte Dam and the ceasing of the malaria control programs, we see again a rise in malaria incidence. However, this increasing incidence did not occur everywhere. So for example, when we look at this image, we can see that areas with low malaria cases are depicted in the light yellow colors, and areas with hundreds of malaria cases are depicted in dark red. We can see, for example, in the map that the Altamira city, which is the area that is like it's zoomed out of the graph, we have hundreds of malaria cases before the construction of Belo Monte Dam, and after the construction of Belo Monte Dam, we have barely no malaria cases in the city. But when we look at the rural areas of Altamira, we see that before the Belo Monte Dam, we have hundreds of cases in the rural areas, and after the Belo Monte Dam, after this period of malaria control and brief elimination in some areas, we have the resurgence of malaria with cases like increasing again to the same level as we had prior to malaria control programs. And in Altamira, we can also see that rural areas are mainly occupied by riverine communities depicted in some of the green areas, and indigenous communities, we are represented by all the yellow areas. We can see and as an example, the riverine community of Riozinho do Frísio faces particularly high malaria incidence. So with this in mind, we had two main aims. The first was to understand the different environmental drivers of malaria transmission in Altamira, in Brazil, before the construction of the Belo Monte Dam, so from 2006 to 2012, and also to identify the land use drivers of malaria resurgence after Belo Monte construction from 2017 to 2022. And again, we extracted data from Map Biomas Brazil, and we extracted data on forest cover, mining cover, and farming cover. However, because we saw no major changes in farming or mining over the years, both of those were not considering our next analysis. And this time, again, we also use Google Earth Engine platform to obtain a remote or to conduct a remote sensing analysis. But this time we calculated 3 different metrics for this study. The first of them was distance to deforestation. Due to the very high forest cover in the region, we use distance to deforestation as a proxy for population exposure to the forest areas. And secondly, we calculated the forest edge perimeter, just like in the previous study, which again is the sum of the perimeter of forest edge in each quadrant. And third, as a proxy for human movement, we estimated the distance in hours of each of those clusters that you can see in the image here on the left, but only the ones in rural areas. So we are not considering the urban area of Altamira anymore because there was no resurgence of malaria. But then we calculated the distance of each of those clusters to the nearest urban center as a proxy for human movement. And then we run generalized addictive models to identify the drivers of malaria prior to the Belo Monte Dam construction and the drivers of malaria resurgence after the construction of Belo Monte. Therefore, we run two identical models for two distinct time periods, one for 2006 to 2011 and another for 2017 to 2020. So for both of those models, we were evaluating malaria cases per year, per cluster, as a function of distance to deforestation, forest edge perimeter, metric of human movement based on the distance to urban centers from each cluster, climatic conditions, and also controlling for local population. Again, we included non-linear cluster and year random effects to control for any endogenous variation of each specific cluster in each specific year. And we found that despite the changed geographic distribution of malaria cases, shifting from urban to rural areas of Altamira, we found the same drivers of malaria before and after Belo Monte malaria control program. In both time periods, increases in forest edge perimeter were associated with increases in malaria cases, with a 1% increase of forest edge habitat being associated with 0.6 to 0.7% increase in malaria cases. We know that in the Amazon, practices such as logging deforestation can increase malaria transmission, and this happens because they increase the area of forest edge, providing larval habitats for Nisorhynchus darlingi vectors, which inhabit the forest edge. This in turn increases the abundance of vectors and the exposure risk of people. Therefore, we suggest that the increase in forest edge habitat rather than deforestation itself is the mechanistic link between increases in malaria transmission and forest loss. Further, we also found that increases in population size are also positively associated with increases in malaria cases. So the conclusion of this work is that increases in forest edge habitat rather than deforestation itself could increase malaria transmission. This suggests that increases in vector breeding habitats could be the main mechanistic link, linking environmental degradation and malaria transmission. And another thing our research suggests is that malaria control programs should be sustained long-term to achieve malaria control and elimination, and that this seems to be particularly true in areas with low access to malaria diagnosis and healthcare, which is often the case of traditional communities in the Brazilian Amazon. So finally, I would like to thank everyone that was involved in the two research I have presented today. Initially, I would like to thank my supervisor, Professor Harry Mordecai, and my collaborators from Brazil, Professor Erika Martins Braga, Professor Jorge Luis Fontes, Erika Pellegrino, Dr. Osvaldo Damasceno for the contribution in this research. I would also like to thank Dr. Eloise Kinner, who co-led the research on malaria resurgence in Altamira with me, and Dr. Sakib Bursa, who was one of our collaborators in this last study. Finally, I would like to thank the Brazilian Ministry of Health and the Brazilian National Indigenous Foundation for providing me with the data used in this research. As a final message, I would like to talk a bit about the image I use in this acknowledgement slide, which This image represents a Yanomami village, the Waturiki village in the Yanomami indigenous land, and is part of a campaign launched in 2020 called Stop COVID, Stop Mining. And to me, it represents that the Yanomami people already knew long time before this study how much the mining effects and how much illegal gold mining can affect human health and would affect their health a long time ago. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Daniela, for a very interesting and somehow worrying talk and very applied research. So I will open now the question panel. Let's see, let me see what we have here. Oops, sorry. Getting there. So I'm just having some troubles because I'm doing this from my cell phone, which is not the usual platform. Here I am again. Okay. So the first question is from Ramaya Nagapa and says, thanks for this important investigation. My first question is, were there non-indigenous miners reporting malaria incidents?
Yes, there were, but the database I use is the one for indigenous people only. So I do not know the exact number of malaria diagnoses for miners there were in the Yanomami territory. Also because when we look at the data for Brazil for the non-indigenous people, the data is usually gathered at municipality level. So you don't really know where the person got infected, at least the publicly available data. If you have access to the health databases that healthcare workers have access, you can have the location. But the publicly available data for non-indigenous people is municipality level. But the data I used did not consider the illegal, the miners that were living there. It was only for indigenous people.
It was focused for the Yanomami. The second question, actually from the same person, Ramaya, is were the reports of fatalities and how long it took to get to the 1% reforestation?
So the 1%, the 1% reforestation is, so when we run those panel model regressions, we were considering trends in malaria cases from 2003 to 2021. And then what those models do is to try to see like trends on, for example, increase in, let's say, secondary vegetation grow, like forest cover in one area. And then they'll do that for every single of the 64 Yanomami infection sites across every single year. And then they try to find a trend with changes in forest cover, in mining cover, and changes in malaria incidents, considering all of the sites and all of the years. So I don't know when exactly there was that 1% increase in forest cover. That's the data that the model is giving me, the 1% increase in forest cover, when considering the data or the change or the malaria incidence for all of the 64 infection sites across 18 years was associated with a decreased malaria incidence by 0.55%. One thing I have found is that when mining was increasing, and I do not show that data in the presentation, there was a decrease in deforestation and increase in secondary vegetation growth in the last few years. And the reason why we believe that this happens is because mining, you can get way more profit from mining. So people, they, instead of logging, they mine, and that allows for secondary vegetation grow and increase in forest cover.
Okay, thanks. There is a question by Sian Henley and says, fascinating talk, thank you. related to the first half of your talk, it is quite clear from your data that malaria incidence got significantly worse during President Bolsonaro's tenure. Is
Yes.
there any evidence that things have now improved under President Lula and the policy changes that have been made, or is it too soon to see those effects?
So the humanitarian crisis still exists, and I do not know the data for like malaria cases in the last year, like 2024, but I know the last report I checked, there were still about 7,000 miners in the Yanomami territory. That was like in the end of last year when I read that information. So it is still an ongoing problem. There is still ongoing illegal gold mining, but what I believe is that the number is considerably smaller because 7,000 is much less than between 20 and 40,000. So it's an ongoing problem. The situation has improved, but it's still not as it was before. It's not normal.
Yes, I guess it's not easy in a couple of years to revert
Yeah.
that.
And one thing is like it's very difficult
Mhm.
sometimes because when you have like the pathway and then you know where the gold is, and then you have people that sponsor the miners to get to the Yanomami territory, it's difficult to break the chain, even with the efforts of the current government. It's you have an established pathway to gold, and then you have buyers for that gold, and you have sponsors that take miners then take the gold out. So it's really difficult to break that.
Yes, it's a very intricate social problem. There is another question from Farouk Fenderesk and says, "Hi Daniela, interesting work and thanks for the great presentation. Did you consider the impact of changes in wetlands, loss or gain on malaria?"
The changes in wetland, what was the other one?
Whether if there were any loss or gain of wetlands, and that if that had an incidence on malaria.
I did not check for wetlands, no. But no, I didn't check.
Yeah. Well, I'm not in the subject. I guess what you were talking about, the forest edge, and you showed some pictures where there were some water in there. I don't know if that can be related to wetlands. I guess that will be you call them pods, isn't it? The
It's
possibility of
puddles.
breathing puddles, yes.
Yes, but I don't think that's called.
Wetlands, no, it
Yeah.
probably doesn't account for wetlands.
I mean, I might be wrong, but I think like what we have in the Amazon is usually like a rainy season and then a dry season that you have like changes in how much the river gets full and how much it gets dry each year. So I'm assuming that that was what he was asking about. Then if that's is what it is, the answer is that I didn't check.
Okay, thanks. So these were the questions in the Q&A box. So I will open now for the panel. If Milton or Nandini or anybody that wants to ask some questions or make some comments, please go ahead.
Sorry, I was muted. So yes, thank you, Vivian. I'd like to thank Daniela for agreeing to present this very interesting webinar today under the auspices of the Trevor Platt Science Foundation. And indeed, illegal mining in Yanomami lands is one of the main causes of malaria and also malnutrition among indigenous people. And mining activity, as you have seen, destroys the forest, alters the habitats of the mosquito that transmits the disease. So more than 30,000 cases of malaria were recorded in Yanomami land, which represents an increase of more than 10% compared to previous years. And also the high mobility of gold miners is also pointed out as a factor that perpetuates the malaria cycle still nowadays. So we can say that mining is the greatest evil we have on Yanomami land today. And this clandestine activity, which have been occupying 4,500 hectares, now occupies 269 hectares, according to more recent data. And most of the miners are young men, aged between 15 and 29 years old, who move frequently between states and even countries. So without a doubt, that studies such as the one that Daniela have presented for us today are important and necessary in view of the current situation. I'd like also to thank Catarina Duarte on behalf of their center for her support and assistance with the transmission and recording of this webinar. We hope to continue our collaboration in the future. I'd also like to thank our colleague Vivian Lutz for kindly helping to coordinate the webinar and all the other colleagues who directly helped to make it happen. And finally, I'd like to thank the listeners present here today, both on the Zoom platforms and on YouTube. And the recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube and on the Air Center and Trevor's Platt Science Foundation websites. So, Vivian, thank you very much.
Thanks, Milton. I think that you took care of the final appreciation. Thanks for everybody. But I still will, I have a question on my own for Daniela. So I will take the opportunity. Really a very interesting talk, a very important work. And as you were saying, and Milton just also emphasized, the problem of mining is very intricate. Just by chance, I just came back from a trip to the north of Argentina. Of course, completely different scenario. There, the problem is not malaria. It's very high altitude and dry. But nevertheless, mining is having an impact on the people, and most of the people are also indigenous communities. It's a very tricky question because on one hand, we see all these problems. In that case, is on, of course, contamination in the water, but at the same time, it gives jobs to these people. So many young people that before they were leaving the area now are coming back to work in there. And it is difficult how to tackle these social aspects. But I think it's very important and pressing question. This is a comment just, but the question to Daniela is whether this, the information from these studies gets directly to the decision makers and how is it received?
The only time I actually presented his research to decision makers was last year at a UN conference on spatial applications for global health. And I have like people, at least the people that were there, they were astonished with the results. And the output of the research was included in one of the UN reports, and I hope that makes a difference. But I have not presented any of those results directly to policymakers in Brazil. I'm trying to publish like in the news when the paper is accepted in local news in Brazil through the University of São Paulo press. But we need to wait for the paper to be accepted. So right now, it's
in the process.
Review. Yeah.
In the review.
Yeah.
So I hope it goes through and that you manage to send apart from the important scientific publication, also to send the message directly to the decision makers, because I wish they take some of this knowledge into account.
Yes.
So if there are no more questions, let's see if there is anyone more. Here there is another comment from Ramaya. Very interesting work. It's so heartening that you have addressed the problem of neglected traditional and remotely inhabiting communities and made a successful attempt in showcasing the world how important it is to be concerned of the continued survival of indigenous people. So again, another congratulations on your. So I think that's closes our webinar from today. And as Milton already mentioned, thank you very much, everybody, for attending, especially Daniela, of course, for taking time from her research to sharing these results with us. Katarina, once more, for your work handling all the logistics of this situation and last minute problems. And we hope to see you all again in a new edition of the Trevor Foundation webinars. So thank you for today. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Tchau. Ok.
Bye.
Muito bem.
Deus.
Tchau, Catarina. Super
Tchau.
obrigado. Dani,
Tchau.
valeu.
Fiquem
A
bem.
gente se fala.
Tchau.
Sucesso.
Very